Welcome back to the arena and this week's Rumble. Here at Sun News, we've been following the events unfolding in Paris this week. That all began with Charlie Hebdo, the controversial satirical newspaper that features polemic cartoons and reports. It's most known for its caricatures of the Islam prophet Muhammad, which positioned Charlie Hebdo early on as a target for terrorist attacks. Joining me in studio is Grant Lafleche, columnist for the Catharines Standard, whose latest column is titled, "Where Do You Stand on Free Speech?" And AM 980 radio host Andrew Lawton. Thank you both for being here. You're both journalists. I want to start by asking you, how far can we push freedom of speech, and where do you stand on the publication of these types of satirical cartoons? Let me start with you.
As I said in my column, there's basically two positions you can have on freedom of speech. If you're for freedom of speech, you're for the speech for those views that you despise. Otherwise, you're not in favor of freedom of speech. It's very easy to sit there and say, I like that opinion, so by all means, have it out there. You have to be willing to accept the publication or broadcast of opinions that you do not like, or you're not in favor of freedom of speech. And the only real limit that I've ever kind of advocated is when you're actually saying things that will is threatening somebody or inciting that somebody else be harmed. Beyond that, it should almost be totally laissez-faire. It should be open game.
Before I get to you, Andrew, let me ask you then, what do you make of networks like the CBC and the New York Daily News blurring the image of Muhammad?
I think
CBC not even airing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Western news outlets who refuse to show any of the cartoons that would be deemed offensive from Charlie, I think should be ashamed of themselves. I think they should be deeply ashamed of themselves. We saw the same thing in 2006 with the Danish cartoons in Europe. Most Western press outlets wouldn't do it. The reaction this time is a little bit better. But there's, you know, it was CNN, it was CBC, it was the Associated Press who refused to show them on the grounds that they're offensive. And when people say, well, it's offensive, and you can see some of them on your monitors now, my answer is, well, so what?
Andrew, I want to take this one step further. I suspect that of the 6 million Muslims living in France, probably a lot of them would condemn the violence that we saw over the last 72 hours. But I also suspect that of those people that condemn the violence, there's a good chunk of them that would probably believe that if you do publish a controversial image of their prophet Muhammad, perhaps you should be imprisoned.
Yeah, and actually, if you were in prison for that, you'd be getting off easy if anyone believed in Sharia law. And this is a system that a lot of people adhere to. People have talked about wanting to instill it in domestic situations like Canada and the U.S. Not members of government, but members of the Muslim community. And under Sharia, it's actually quite unequivocal. If you parody or satirize or even mock the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, of course, you're actually a valid candidate for the death penalty. And I think that in and of itself shows us the fundamental problem with not the religion of Islam, but the ideology of Islam. And I think that's very distinct from the Muslims, the majority of whom, of that 6 million you mentioned, would not support this. It's irrelevant because there are a subset that do support this, as small as it is, and that's a problem that needs to be addressed.
Can Islam be compatible then with liberal democracy?
Here's the problem. People will often say to you, well, you don't see Catholics or Mennonites bursting into magazine offices with machine guns, and it's true. But Christianity has evolved along with Western society, evolved in a culture that developed modern democracy. Most of the Muslim world are countries where if you speak out against the government or you speak out against the governing royal family, you can be imprisoned, you can be killed. Western ideals of freedom of religion and freedom of speech do not exist. So is it compatible with Western ideals? Well, most Canadian Muslims would say yes, because they live happily in our culture and aren't doing anything awful, and you know they're no different than anybody else. But if you're asking, is the culture of the Middle East or the ideology of Islam, as Andrew said, as it exists now in the Middle East, compatible with Western ideals, I would say probably not.
Well, and to dovetail on that, there's a fundamental question that needs to be asked, which is that if Islam is a progressive, egalitarian sort of religion in which anyone can enjoy freedoms and democracies, why is there not a single Muslim country that affords its citizens basic human rights? And you look at Israel as an example. Israel, a desert nation surrounded by a huge number of Arab and Muslim countries, same access to resources, same basic geography, yet that country, Israel, which is the only non-Muslim nation there, exceeds in science, technology, human rights, democracy, medicine, any number of areas on the global front. That says there is, to me, a problem, not with Islam necessarily as a religion, but with the enacting of Islam as a form of government. And that is, I think, a huge problem that needs to be addressed, because it's the people who are wanting Islam to be a form of government as opposed to just a religion that they adhere to that are causing all of these acts of violence. violence around the world, in Paris, in Canada, in the U.S., and so on.
What do you make of the no-go zones that we hear about in France, about 1,000 of them? They're sort of like self-made ghettos, you know, and you think about sort of the nationals of EU 25. They're entitled to move freely within these states. What should we do about that?
I think that any time you start restricting access to areas based on any factors, you're moving into a very dangerous territory. Look, there are places that anyone who lives in a city that has had problems with poverty or gangs or violence just knows not to go in. I mean, yeah. I know that I'm not going to go to certain intersections in Toronto. I know that I'm not going to go into certain intersections in cities that I visit. But that's something that I choose.
But isn't that fostering radicalization, though?
It is absolutely. It's fostering radicalization. It's fostering the building of ghettos. One of the basic tenets of a democracy, they're what? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to vote, freedom of movement. You have a problem in Europe right now with waves of illegal immigrants, much like the United States deals with immigrants coming up from Mexico. We have in Europe immigrants coming from the Middle East into Europe, into these no-go zones or into these almost ghettoized areas, and they become insular. And if you get a radical philosophy that takes a grip in these neighborhoods, it just becomes like an oven. And that can just produce more and more of them. And that's probably where you start to see the spread of ideology for so-called homegrown terrorism as well. That's where it's going to come from.
Oh, and even looking outside of France, you look at just a couple of years ago, the Tower Hamlets, essentially, a suburb of London, England, where it's basically this enclave that is governed, not officially, but de facto by Islamism. And that's because people have just sort of put this in a box and in a bubble and said, we can't deal with that, we can't address that. A huge part of that has been political correctness. Now, France has gone, I think, a little bit over the line in terms of restricting certain forms of freedom of expression for Muslims. And while I understand the rationale for that, I think that has inflamed this in a lot of ways, such as banning the burqa. I mean, I know it's a contentious issue in Canada. I think that misses the mark on what they actually should have been focusing on this whole time.
What should they have been focusing on?
Addressing the ideology, not addressing the sort of window dressing of Islam. I mean, by telling a Muslim person you can't wear a burqa in public, you're not getting rid of the ideology that motivates that person, motivates that impression, motivates that subjugation of women.
They're not doing, I think, a particularly good job of taking immigrants who come into Europe, places like France or Germany or Britain, and sort of assimilating them into their broader culture. It may be, less multicultural than ours, but it's very similar in many respects. And if you're not able to take these immigrants and show them and that this way of living is better, there's more opportunities for them, there's more respect for them, it's safer for them. If you fail at that, this is what you get as a result.
Perhaps easier said than done. Okay, we're going to pause it right there. We'll come back after the break. Stay with us. For more stories, check out the Sun News Network Facebook page, facebook.com/Sun News Network. More Rumble coming up.
Now, in your eyes, would that be, and I am included in this category as someone who has shared those pictures, is that grounds for capital punishment under Sharia?
Well, if someone is doing something to dishonor the prophets, and definitely drawing that particular image does that. If someone is promoting it in order to put them down and dishonor them, then that would carry a similar punishment, definitely.
That was an Islamic imam, Anjem Chowdhury. He's been on our network a few times. The man should probably be in jail. Not sure why he isn't yet, but he was talking to Andrew Lawton, who joins me here on set, and we've got Grant Lafleche to continue the rumble. Let's talk about Anjem Chowdhury quickly, because this is a British imam whose passport's been revoked. He's been quite vocal about how he wants to travel to Syria or Iraq and join the ranks of ISIS, and yet the British government is keeping him there. Right response?
It's difficult because I think Britain is stuck between a rock and a hard place here. Because if I were the British government, I'd be saying, great, we'll pay for your plane ticket, just don't come back. The problem is international law says that because he's a British citizen, if they were to give him a passport, he goes to northern Iraq, he goes to Syria, etc., to live, then he can someday say, all right, I want back in. And the British government is then forced to readmit a man who has committed far potentially more worse acts, said far more things, and maybe bringing with him people or family members, etc., that are going to be concerning for domestic security. I think that when you start looking at terrorism and terrorists, you're in a very difficult place because we still need to respect international law when it comes to citizenship. Revoking a passport keeps someone within your borders. But giving them the passport allows them to go and either fight or recruit or do any number of other things. And the correct solution is emotionally to people to lock them up, but you can't do that just because someone has said concerning things. You need to prosecute based on action, not words.
What we saw in France the last few days, one of those guys instrumental in attacking the 12 individuals and ultimately killing them, we are now hearing reports that he was trained and financed in Yemen. So he was able to leave France and go and get training in Yemen. They didn't seize his passport.
That's a failure probably of the French, I would say the French intelligence apparatus at the end of the day. You would think that if somebody traveling to a country where you have known terrorist training facilities, that this person might come under questioning when they get back. I don't know that necessarily revoking a passport does you any good. I mean, just to play devil's advocate for a minute. So let's say they don't revoke that guy's passport. He never goes to Yemen to get training, so he knows how to use that gun. Does he stay radicalized in France?
Yeah, but the argument is he then went to Yemen and he became an even greater security threat because he got that training. So if you keep him in the country, we have what happened in Ottawa with this idiot who went and attacked Parliament, but he really didn't know what was going on.
But the threat is not the training, though. The threat is the ideology itself. I mean, anyone can learn how to make a bomb online. I mean, look at the Boston bombers. They didn't need to be trained to be dangerous. Look at cases like a very widely known case in London, Ontario recently, where you have a bunch of sort of oddball guys meet in high school, end up going overseas, 2 of them dead in an Algerian gas plant explosion, 1 of them living back in London as though nothing had happened. I mean, every intelligence agency fails.
The passport's a red herring. The passport is a red herring. If you've got people traveling from Canada, the United States, France, Britain, to terrorist training camps in the Middle East and coming back, how is it that their travel plans are not known? Why is the intelligence community not picking this up? Because that's what they're supposed to do.
That's not the problem, though. It's hard to build a case against someone who's overseas. That's the problem. And because we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms here in Canada, if you have a passport, you're welcomed right back in. Yes, the government can do everything they can to track these guys, but it's still hard.
But that's the whole point. If you know that if somebody knows you have gone off to the Middle East and you've been in a country where people go to be trained as a terrorist and you come back, the intelligence apparatus fails if they don't know that. And if you're not being, at that point, there's justification to actually watch your activities domestically. Taking away their passport, all that does, like Andrew says, you can learn to shoot a gun or build a bomb locally. You don't need to go overseas to do that. And in a place like France, where you do have the ghettos and sort of the no-go neighborhoods, they can find, if they want to, they can find somebody to help them get their hands on materials to commit acts of terror.
I would much rather have a terrorist overseas than in my own country. I would much rather have a radical, potentially dangerous person in another country than in my own. Because they're far more dangerous if you keep them here.
But you recognize that there is a major difference between what happened in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu and what happened in Ottawa versus what happened in Paris.
Absolutely.
These guys they were orchestrated from on high. They were basically getting instruction from an Al-Qaeda cell in Yemen, and that makes them that much more dangerous, no?
Look at just to take a quick aside, look at serial killers in the United States. Predominantly not Muslim, predominantly white males, astronomical body counts, right? With weapons they can get in their own towns and own cities. You don't need to travel overseas to be radicalized and learn to be dangerous. I completely agree it's a problem.
Yeah, but when you're looking at that's a very flawed comparison, though. I mean, serial killers one at a time over a span of weeks, months, days, mass murderers and terrorists, dozens in a day.
The point being is that if somebody is bound and determined to do harm to people and they want to get their hands on the material to do it, in the 21st century, it's not hard to do. And they don't have to travel overseas. My point is revoking their passport doesn't necessarily make them less dangerous at the end of the day. And if there are people moving from Western countries to be trained in Middle Eastern Al-Qaeda or ISIS training camps, then our intelligence apparatus ought to be doing a better job.
The problem is, though, is that our intelligence apparatus is so focused on incoming and outgoing people in the country and not focused enough on where the radicalization is occurring. When you have people who are born to non-Muslim families who are radicalized on Canadian soil or American soil or British soil without having ever left the country, and no one is addressing where that's happening.
The passport's a red herring.
I know, but you need to do both, though, and this is the problem, is that we don't have enough focus on the actual mosques where this is happening. We don't have enough focus on the people and ultimately the trainers and recruiters on domestic soil. So I think both need to be done, and it's foolish to try to say one or the other is the only solution.
You say you want to focus more on mosques. What should we be doing to monitor them?
There have been a few cases in Canada. They're limited, but there have been a few cases, including one in Niagara around the time of the 9/11 attacks, where there are some radicalization going on in the mosques. The only way you're going to know that is to have people in those facilities. You need. I mean, it sounds kind of creepy, but you need law enforcement in there watching to see what's going on in some of these mosques.
Even if they say that's an infringement on our civil liberties.
Well, how else are you going to know? I mean, you can't at the end of the day have organizations. If you suspect that Mosque X happens to be home to a cleric who's spewing really radicalized stuff and trying to recruit young men or young women into some kind of terrorist activity, how else are you going to find out that's going on unless you either have a snitch on the inside or you have an observer on the inside in one form or another?
It's not practical to expect that you can police mosques across the country, and you have to then expand it into the obvious question that people are going to ask and say, well, why this mosque, not that mosque? Do we go after the Muslim schools as well? Well, but at the same time, though, I don't even necessarily think the clerics are the problem as much as individual people within the communities. And this is the problem here, is that you're fighting against ideology. You're not fighting against something that is as easily defined as, oh, look, that guy's wearing a uniform. He's against us here. You can do it, but we need a lot more vigilance and a lot less fear that we're going to offend people or step on people's toes. And it's nothing to do with civil liberties, because you can do it by exercising basic intelligence without going down this road of racial profiling.
We can bust biker gangs, international mafia, drug cartels. To say that you can't monitor or bust international terrorist activity, it's a law enforcement issue at the end of the day. You apply this exact same tactics as you would as if you were busting an international drug cartel.
All right, you two, that was a great discussion. That's all the time we have. Thank you for joining me. Let us know what you think. Send us an email at thearena@sunmedia.ca. Don't go away.